The peonies hit the cobbles before old Tomas Brescu understood what had happened. One moment Donna Lucia was lifting her bundle into the crook of her arm, gloved fingers closing around the brown paper as she had done at his stall every Friday for 40 years. The next, a small fashionable dog had bolted on a long lead. A stranger had stumbled hard into the old woman's back, and the white peonies were rolling at her feet like dropped letters. Tomas was 76. He had sold peonies from the same striped awning on the same narrow lane since he was 36, and he had loved Donna Lucia Galantieri the way an old man loves a dignified customer, at a distance with respect, and with the quiet pride of knowing she came to him and to no one else. He knew her late husband's name. He knew which of her grandchildren liked the pink peonies and which liked the white. He had never, in 40 years, seen anyone touch her without her leave. The stranger did not apologize. That was the part that struck Tomas first. Not the bump, not the dropped flowers, not even Donna Lucia's gloved hand catching herself on the lip of his stall. The stranger did not apologize. She was a young woman in her late 20s in a pale-fitted coat that cost more than Tomas's entire awning, holding a small, bright-eyed dog by a leather lead the dog had clearly chosen not to honor. Her face, when she turned, was sharp and uninterested. "Watch where you're standing," the young woman said to Donna Lucia. Tomas opened his mouth, but Donna Lucia was already bending slowly to gather the peonies. She was 77. Her cane was hooked over the edge of the stall. Her gloved fingers shook a little, only a little, as she reached. "You shouldn't block the lane," the stranger went on, gathering the dog up against her hip without looking at the old woman she had just knocked off balance. "People like you should keep to the edges if you're so unsteady." Tomas felt the old, useless heat rise behind his eyes. He started forward, but he was a stall-keeper with a counter between him and the lane, and his knees were not the knees of a younger man, and before he could come around the cart, 3 steps from the stall next door, a young woman in a long denim apron was already stepping out. Her name was Marian Avro. She had worked the stock stall on Tomas's left for 9 months, and she was the kind of young woman a market notices slowly, then steadily, then completely. She was perhaps 25. Her dark hair was tied back with a strip of green grosgrain ribbon she'd cut from a spool last Easter. Her cotton dress was plain, faded a little at the seams. Her hands were the working hands of a girl who had cut stems all morning and would cut stems all afternoon. She did not raise her voice. She did not look at the stranger first. She looked at Donna Lucia. Then she knelt. Tomas would tell his wife about it that night, and again the next morning over coffee. The way Marian Avro knelt on the cobblestones, in front of God and the lane and 4 other vendors who had stopped what they were doing without hurry, without performance, as if she were kneeling at her own work. She gathered the peonies one by one. She straightened the bent stems with the side of her thumb. She put them back into the brown paper and folded the top of the paper down twice, the way Tomas himself had folded it 10 minutes earlier when he handed the bundle across. She lifted the gray scarf that had slipped to the ground, brushed the grit from it once with the back of her hand, folded it neatly, and laid it over Donna Lucia's wrist. Only then did she stand. Only then did she face the stranger. "She did not block your lane," Marian said. Her voice was not loud. It carried because it did not need to be loud. "Your dog did, and she is owed an apology." The stranger laughed once, a short, surprised sound. "Mind your own stall, girl." Marian did not move. Her hands, Tomas saw, were perfectly still at her sides. "This is my market," she said. "She is on my street. I will mind both of them." It was the quiet of it that did the work. The dog had given up bolting and was sitting on the cobbles, panting. A woman from the herb stall 2 doors down had folded her arms across her apron and was watching with the flat, patient face of someone who had also seen the bump and had been waiting to see what was made of it. The man who sold candles across the lane had set down his tray. Donna Lucia stood very still, her cane in one hand, the folded peonies in the other, her face composed. The stranger looked from Marian to the herb stall woman, to the candle man, to old Tomas at his counter, and to the half-dozen other faces that had turned in the slow, unembarrassed way of a market that had decided. She mumbled something. Tomas heard the word *sorry and not much else, bent for the dog, and walked away down the lane. The dog gave one regretful look at a pigeon and trotted after. Marian turned back to Donna Lucia. "May I walk you to your car, ma'am?" she asked. "The cobbles past the cathedral are bad." Donna Lucia looked at her for what felt like a long time. There was nothing on her face Tomas could name, and everything. She moved her cane to her left hand. She lifted her right. "You may, child," she said. And Marian Avro, a florist's assistant in a denim apron with a green ribbon in her hair, who had no idea who the small, dignified woman beside her was, offered her bare hand to a gloved hand that had not been offered to a market girl in 77 years, and took Donna Lucia Galanteri's arm with the steady, easy care of someone walking her own great-aunt home. They went past Tomas's stall together. Marian did not look at him. Donna Lucia did. She inclined her head only a little, and Tomas inclined his back because 40 years had taught him when to be invisible and when to be witness. They went past the herb stall. They went under the striped awning at the lane's mouth. They went out into the wider street that ran past the old cathedral, where the cobbles turned cruel for an old woman's ankles, and Marian shortened her steps without saying she was shortening them, and Donna Lucia did not need to say thank you for that because she had already said it by accepting the arm. At the corner where the family driver sat with the long dark car, the door was already open. Tomas heard later what the driver had seen, the last 50 meters, the way the young woman had walked the old one, the way she had handed her in, the way she had stepped back without expecting to be paid or thanked or seen again. The driver was a man named Stefan Mers who had carried Donna Lucia's groceries since before Marian was born. He noticed everything. He noticed the green ribbon in the girl's hair. He noticed the long denim apron. He noticed the stall she walked back to. He did not say a word that afternoon, but he came back the next Friday alone in his own clothes, and he bought peonies from Tomas for the first time in his life, and he stood for a long minute at the next stall over, looking, and then he went home to the family house at the top of the city where he had served 3 generations and asked to see the chief of staff. The chief of staff, a man who had spoken plainly to 7 boys who became dons, listened. Then he went up the wide oak stairs to the study and spoke plainly to the 8th. Don Aurelian Galanteri was 42 years old. He had been head of the family for 11 of those years. He was tall and broad-shouldered with dark hair graying at the temples and a short trimmed beard, and he wore his suits the way other men wore their skin. He had seen the inside of more careful rooms than most men see in a lifetime, and he had learned young to listen without moving his face. He sat at his father's old desk and listened to Stefan Mers's report through the chief of staff, and the only thing that moved was the line of his jaw at the part about people like you should keep to the edges. When the chief of staff finished, Don Aurelian was quiet for a long moment. "Her name," he said. "Marian Avro, sir. She has worked the stock stall on the lane for 9 months. She lives in 2 rooms above the seamstress on Vintner's Row. She sends a small sum every month to a great-aunt who raised her, in a town called Liesta, 3 hours south. And she does not know. She does not know, sir. The driver is certain." Don Aurelian sat with that for another moment. Then he opened the drawer of the desk, took out a single sheet of his own writing paper, no embossment, no seal, no family mark, and a fountain pen that had been his father's. He wrote for perhaps 4 minutes. He folded the page once. He sealed it with the kind of plain envelope you can buy in any stationer's, and addressed it in his own hand to Miss Marian Avro, the stock stall, the flower market. He sent it by the household, by a man Marian would never recognize and the man would never explain. The letter said her name. It thanked her plainly for what she had done. It mentioned no money, no favor, no future request. It was signed only with a first name she did not recognize. Marian read it twice in the back room of her stall, by a single bare bulb. Then she folded it and put it in the small wooden box where she kept the letters from her great-aunt and the postcards from the seamstress's son away at sea, and she went back out to her counter and finished her afternoon. She told no one. The next Friday, Donna Lucia herself came back. She came not in the long dark car but in her own small one, which she still drove on Fridays because she was 77 and not yet ready to be driven everywhere. And she came not for peonies first but for the stock stall, where she set down a small woven basket and laid back the cloth on top. "From my orchard," she said, 6 pears, from my chapel garden a jar of honey, and she lifted out a small square of white linen edged in lace, very old, very fine. "Mine." Marian looked at her. Tomas, 3 stalls down, was pretending to count buckets. "Ma'am," Marian said, "you don't owe me." "Hush, child," said Donna Lucia, with the formality of a woman raised in another age. "I am not paying you, I am thanking you. The 2 are different things, and your great-aunt would have taught you that." Marian's hand closed around the handkerchief. They talked for an hour that day, about Liesta, about the great-aunt Tilda 91, 2 cataracts and a flowerbed of dahlias, about the seamstress on Vintner's Row, about peonies and which ones lasted and why the white kind needed cooler water than the pink. Tomas, eavesdropping shamelessly, heard Donna Lucia laugh twice, the small, reluctant laugh he hadn't heard from her since her husband died. When she left, she said only, "I will come back next Friday," and she did, and the Friday after. 6 weeks later was Donna Lucia's 78th birthday. The house at the top of the city was set for a small private supper, 8 chairs, the matriarch's own table linens, the silver her mother had brought from the old country. At her right hand, Donna Lucia asked her son to set a chair for a young woman from the flower market, and her son said only, "Of course, mother." He was the one who opened the door. Marian Avro stood on the threshold in a clean dark blue dress and the lace-edged handkerchief tucked into her sleeve, and she looked at the man at the door and did not, for 1/2 second, know him. She had never seen him before. She had read his first name twice on a folded page and put the page in a box. She did not know whose son she had walked across cobbles for, or whose mother had laughed at her jokes about white peonies and cooler water. She knew none of it. The man at the door did not stand stiff. He inclined his head, the way Tomas had inclined his on the day of the dropped peonies, a small, private courtesy. "Miss Avro," he said, "thank you plainly for what you did." She looked at him for a long moment, and something in her face, Donna Lucia, watching from the doorway behind him, would tell her son later that this was the moment she understood, something in her face composed. "What I did, sir," Marian said, "anyone in that lane should have done." Don Aurelian was quiet a beat, then he stepped back to let her pass. Behind him in the doorway, Donna Lucia laughed once, very small, and said to her son, "She speaks the way your father did, my heart. Stop staring." He was the one, 10 weeks later, who began to come down to the market on the Fridays his schedule permitted. Not every Friday, not even most, the ones he could. He would stand at the end of the lane in a charcoal coat without insignia, and he would walk down past Tomas's stall the way any other careful man walks down a market, and he would buy from Marian's counter stock, sometimes peonies, sometimes only the small bunches of sweet pea she kept for her own kitchen, and he would carry her boxes to the lane's mouth when the rain caught them. He learned the names of the peonies. He learned which kind needed the cooler water. He learned that Tilda's last cataract had been corrected on a Tuesday in July, and that the dahlias were taller this year than last. At the end of the season, he stood at her counter on a quiet afternoon and asked her plainly whether she would consider letting him court her on her own terms, with her grey-tant's blessing first. Marian set down the shears. "I'll go down to see her next leave," she said. "I would be honored," said Don Aurelian, "to drive you." Tomas Brescu, 3 stalls down, did not pretend to count buckets that time. He stood at his own counter in his old white apron, and he watched the daughter of nobody he knew put her shears down beside a man whose name half the city would not speak above a whisper. And he saw what he had seen in his own front room 46 years before when he asked his wife the same question. And he thought, in the slow, proud way of an old peony seller who had loved a dignified customer at a distance for 40 years and now found himself, at 76, the witness to her son's whole softened heart. Good, that is how it is supposed to go. He turned back to his peonies. There were still customers to serve. There were always customers to serve. But the cobbles that afternoon looked clean to him in a way they had not looked clean in a long time, and the awning above his head, striped, faded, mended in 3 places by his wife's careful hand, felt for one steady moment like the roof of a place where the right things, against the odds, sometimes still happened.